Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Filter. On this show, we recognize that the world can be a confusing place to live in. So what I seek to do on this show is to equip you to live with biblical clarity in our confusing world, so that you can face the chaos of life with wisdom, integrity, and courage. Speaking of chaos, over the last several weeks, the world has watched as tensions increased between Russia and Ukraine. These tensions released into an all-out invasion by Russia that brought about terror and violence in Ukraine. Leaders in the West are debating how to respond, and the media is bringing us rapid updates with varying degrees of veracity. It's easy to get caught up in the whirlwind of reporting, politics, and human suffering. Many of us have found it disorienting to navigate this situation, both as citizens in a democratic republic and as Christians. That's why I'm glad to welcome William Wolfe as my guest on today's show, to help us by bringing some clarity to these current events and provide an example of a discerning response. William had over a decade of experience working in the federal government. He was a legislative assistant for 3 different members of Congress, the director of House Affairs for the U.S. Department of State, and finally, as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for House Affairs at the Pentagon. He currently lives in Louisville, Kentucky, and is pursuing a Master of Divinity from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. For a younger guy, William has an incredible story, and you can read his whole bio in my show notes. I definitely recommend it. I appreciate the audience here on Filter so much, and I want to continue bringing you better quality and more content. So I'm excited to share that you can now send voice messages to Filter to share your thoughts and reflections on our episodes. If you've ever been listening to one of my conversations with a guest and had a question or a thought pop up into your head, well, you can now share those by sending me a voice message. This is going to be awesome because, number one, I want to hear from you guys, the listeners and audience, and also because I'll be sharing select messages that are sent through, whether they be thoughts, questions, or messages, to interact with those and to answer those questions in new bonus episodes that I'll be releasing in between the regular episodes. So if you've been listening to Filter and you have a question about one of the episodes, a question about this episode, if you have thoughts that you'd like to share and interact with the show, I'd love for you to do that. So send in your questions and reflections through the link that is in the description of this podcast, or go to the link that I'll have in the show notes as well. And you can follow through there to go to Anchor and leave me a 1-minute voice message. Anchor will allow you to leave up to a 1-minute message. It's as easy as sending and submitting a voicemail whenever you call somebody. Lastly, before we dive into this episode, let me encourage you to subscribe to our email list if you have not done that already, so that you can get all of the latest content sent directly into your inbox. Just visit the link in the show notes and you can sign up on my website. Also, be sure that you're subscribed to Filter, wherever you get your podcasts, so that you don't miss out on any future episodes. If you're helped by this content, we'd really appreciate it if you left us a rating and review or shared the show with your friends. Leave Filter a 5-star review on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts, and also write a review on Apple Podcasts. It'll only take a minute of your time, and whenever you take these simple steps, it greatly helps us to get the message of biblical clarity out to more people. Well, without any further delay, let's jump into my conversation with William Wolfe. William, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. Good to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you on here. Been looking forward to it. We've been interacting on Twitter a little bit. I've been following you now for a while and really enjoyed it. And so I've been looking forward to having you on and getting to talk to you. We're going to be talking about some current events and, we'll see what all we get into. But I thought it'd be interesting for us to start by just talking about your story. Tell us about your story, both what you're doing now, but also how you got to where you are now, what you did in your past, and how that helps us to understand your unique perspective on the current events around Russia and Ukraine.
Sure, thanks. Well, I'm coming to you currently live from the campus of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And if you had asked me, would I ever find myself as an in-person student at a Southern Baptist Theological Seminary when I was, 20 years old, I wouldn't have had a category for what you were asking me. And so how I've gotten to where I am is, of course, only by the grace and the sovereign providence of our good and heavenly Father. So I became a Christian out of college, actually, after experiencing some tough times and some deep loss of my younger brother when he was 15 and I was 22. And through dealing with that grief from the perspective of a false convert, somebody who thought I was a Christian, but I wasn't, it ended up leading me, by God's grace, to an interaction with Mark Dever in Washington, D.C., and he's a pastor of Capital Baptist Church there. And he was kind enough to tell me that just because I said a prayer when I was 9 years old, it didn't necessarily make me a Christian. And the way that I was living my life at the time, to him, indicated that I probably wasn't. And God used that interaction, and by reading the book of Isaiah, I believe, to bring me to repentance and faith. And that was at the end of 2011. And then he just sort of blew open all the doors and brought me to our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., to join Capitol Hill Baptist Church. That was the main reason I moved there. And then I needed to work. You know, if a man doesn't work, he won't eat. So I actually got a job waiting tables at a PF Chang's to hold me over while I pursued work on Capitol Hill. And I ended up working for a couple different members of Congress, working as a legislative staffer in their offices, for a member of Congress from North Dakota, from North Carolina, for Virginia. So I became acquainted with how Congress works, how the legislative process works, our politics in our country. I joke that I spent 2 years reading constituent mail from the 5th District of North Carolina, which is a pretty rural district. And it radicalized me because, only unhappy people write in. But after working for a few members of Congress, I worked at a political organization called Heritage Action, which combined grassroots and standard government relations advocacy to sort of actualize conservative policies on behalf of the conservative base out there in the country, in tandem with the Heritage Foundation. And then after Trump won in 2016, for someone like me, this was the opportunity to work in the administration, to serve the American people, to help advance policies that I believed would lead to better life opportunities for those in our country, for everyone, whether you voted for him or not. And so I took that opportunity. I volunteered on the Presidential Transition Organization. And by doing that, I got my name on a list for the State Department. It's funny, I had an opportunity, a guaranteed spot at the Department of Agriculture, and I turned that down for a possible spot at the Department of State. And by God's grace, it worked out. So I did legislative affairs for the State Department for about 3 years. I ultimately became our director of House Affairs. So I was one of the main liaison points with the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which oversees the Department of State, their policies, their priorities, the money, the way they use their money. And so I worked with Congress day in, day out. I've prepped ambassadors for hearings. I don't know if you've ever watched congressional hearings, but you'll see this row of people sitting behind the main witness. Well, that was usually me, part of that row. And then I had an opportunity to go over to the Pentagon and do the same thing, but at a higher level. I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for House Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. And it was an excellent opportunity to help lead our team. Myself and the Senate, my Senate counterpart, oversaw a team of about 60 folks who engaged and represented the Department of Defense before the House Armed Services Committee on every policy issue pertaining to our military actions under the sun, and also helping us get past the annual National Defense Authorization Act. So I've been working in and with Congress for over a decade. I've worked in the national security space in particular for about 4 years, foreign affairs, national security. And then when my time in the administration came to an end, I took a big transition, and I did a pastoral internship at my church. And then I came here to Southern Seminary to finish my MDiv and to look at doing a PhD in Christian ethics and public theology. So that's where I am now.
Yeah, that's quite the journey. And yeah, you never know which way God's going to take you in life. But I mean,
that's true.
Just listening to your story, as just an ordinary person, I'm hearing all these different departments and titles, and it starts to just seem a little like overwhelming. Like, oh, great. Well, but I have no idea what that means. So for the other ordinary folk like me, so your job at the Pentagon, working with defense in the day-to-day, what did that mean? You explained before you'd be helping ambassadors prep for their hearings. But what you're doing at the Pentagon, your last position that you had, which I think will probably be like the most relevant to talking about the issues we're talking about today. Speaking
Yeah.
of, State Department of Defense. Yeah. In the day to day, what did that look like? What did that mean? What you were doing there?
Sure. Both the jobs very relevant to this issue. I coordinated I talked to Congress on behalf of the executive branch agency. So Congress oversees the executive branch. They're the ones who provide them the money and give them the policy priority. So they say, do this, don't do that. Spend your money this way, don't spend it that way. And then they oversee them. So they haul them up for hearings. So I emailed back and forth with congressional staffers very regularly, but I also spoke directly with members of Congress as well. And at the Department of Defense, at the Pentagon, it was very similar. I prepped generals, so I'd be prepping 2, 3, 4-star generals for appearing before their hearings, coordinating within what's called the interagency, and that just means the Department of Defense, the State Department, the National Security Council, our intelligence agencies, FBI, CIA, DIA. I don't mean to be giving too many acronyms there, but that's so when Congress got mad at what the Trump administration was doing, whether at state or DOD, I would be one of the first people to find out about it.
Yeah. Wow.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. What a privilege. You were the first whipping boy.
That's right.
So what were some of the primary experiences or things that you got to be a part of during your time working in government and the administration that really stick out to you, that your memories will carry with you, the kind of stuff that you like to talk about over drinks?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm a Baptist, so the drinks is coffee. But
coffee,
there we go. Yeah,
coffee, tea, whatever floats your boat.
In case Dr. Mueller sees this, which you probably won't. But I'll tell you,
he loves his podcast.
Oh, fantastic!
He loves it. He's our biggest fan.
Briefing. One of the most amazing things I had an opportunity to do was to be a staffer on a congressional delegation. That's when members of Congress get together and take trips overseas. The shorthand for that is CODEL, Congressional Delegation. And when I was working at the State Department in 2019, it was the 75th anniversary of the D-Day invasion in Europe, which ultimately turned the tide of World War II, the invasion in Normandy, France, on Omaha Beach. And I had the distinct privilege and opportunity to travel over to that with a massive congressional delegation of 60 plus members from the House of Representatives, led by the Speaker of the House, who was still Nancy Pelosi at the time, but bipartisan, Republicans, Democrats. There's about a dozen senators as well. So I had the opportunity to be out at the 75th celebration where there are veterans, and it was probably the last big one with a substantial gathering of World War II veterans, just given their age and their stage. So to be there at that historic landscape and that place, as we consider the sacrifices that were made by those young soldiers to bring an end to the horrors of World War II. And to see that firsthand. I also had a chance to visit a World War I cemetery when I was there as well. So that would probably be the top one. A second one would be I had the privilege, I guess you could call it, of helping spearhead the first ever public congressional hearing we did on what was then the Afghanistan peace deal. We secured this negotiated agreement between the Taliban, the Afghan government, the United States, and we were being threatened with subpoenas, which is sort of a legal enforcement mechanism. And I was able to help negotiate away a subpoena and get our special representative Khalilzad up, along with representatives from the Department of Defense, Department of State, to testify on that. That was a historic moment. Unfortunately, that hasn't gone as we would have hoped it would. That agreement's been shattered and the Taliban's taken over the country.
Wow.
So it's interesting even to reflect on that as you ask me how temporary some of these gains can be in foreign policy and in the international space, and just the brutal realism of a world where there are many men and organizations, Putin, the Taliban, who still view violence as their means to power and control.
Yeah. Yeah. So in 2015 and 16, I was not a fan of Trump, and was very much not wanting him to be the nominee, and I didn't vote for him. But I hope for the best, just like I do with any president, because they're our leader. I want them to do well. One of the first things, excuse me, one of the first things that impressed me in his administration was foreign policy,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly pursuing peace over hawkish policies that would produce more bloodshed. And
Absolutely.
so, yeah, I think so. I'm really interested in hearing about your participation in the Afghanistan peace deal and so on, especially now with that being a few years in the past, seeing how things went. What do you see? What was the major problem? Was the plan followed and the plan just didn't work out as it was supposed to? Was the original plan abandoned? Why did, in your reading and from your experience, why did the Afghanistan withdrawal? Because I think even these things are a part of the context of where we are now with Russia, Ukraine. Why did the Afghanistan withdrawal turn out to be such a debacle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't necessarily refresh myself on the details of that one for this conversation. I was looking more heavily at the state of play in Ukraine and Russia, but in general scopes, look, the reality was we had been fighting in Afghanistan for 20 years, and the American public were growing frustrated with the continued loss of American blood and treasure, lives and money in Afghanistan. And quite frankly, one of the biggest issues there, and this plays into issues with Ukraine, is that the Afghanistan government, the people, not the Taliban, but the civil government representatives and the individuals, never displayed a real commitment to a non-corrupt vision of what we would understand to be sort of Western liberal democracy. Their established civic government was thoroughly corrupt and ineffectual. We were training and equipping the Afghan National Security Forces to try to help them to be a bulwark against the Taliban. And one of our lines in the sand, our request for the Taliban, if they wanted to come to the table, is that they would stop, carrying themselves as a terrorist organization, either harboring Al Qaeda or committing acts of terror. The Taliban are certainly more than just a terrorist organization. Though they do engage in terror, they are an intricate political entity in Afghanistan with quite a bit of support from a variety of people in the country. So the Taliban's long game was just to wait us out. Now the Trump administration, sought to negotiate a deal between the Taliban, between the Afghanistan national government, between us, between our NATO partners and allies who had been involved in this fight with us. That would put everybody on a better footing for peace, but it did need to be enforced, and we needed to have a stable and secure presence, a minimal presence, but a stable and secure presence. And if I'm remembering correctly, President Biden just, we had started some of a drawdown, but then he just accelerated that drawdown without anticipating, without knowing. I guess our intel was off, which quite frankly, to those who are listening to this, I can say this without divulging anything classified or otherwise, but if you're skeptical of our intelligence agencies after working hand in hand with them for 4 years, I would just encourage you in that skepticism. So, I think that sometimes if you question the nature of the official reports you hear in the United States, you can get labeled conspiracy theorist, but there's a lot of guesswork going on. And so I think faulty intelligence reports led to overconfidence. We had an accelerated drawdown that I don't believe the Afghanistan national government was anticipating, and the Taliban seized on the vacuum and rolled through. And at that point, unless we're about to recommit a strength of forces in order to roll them back and essentially engage into a hot war again, we had lost the moment. I think we underestimated the Taliban's absolute resolve to retake the country in the name of Islam, in the name of jihad. And they're motivated. They're motivated not just by a worldview, they're motivated by a religious view. And that's something that I think Americans have really underestimated and still need to wrestle with vis-a-vis Islamic countries.
Yeah. Yeah. Hard to believe that was less than a year ago.
Yeah.
That went down and happened. And here we are with another foreign policy crisis on our hands. This one,
just from one to the next.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will say back to your Trump point, I was originally a Cruz guy in the primary, but I didn't have much great qualms about Trump. And actually, Aaron, if I could make this point to you here briefly, and to anyone listening, you have to understand that there's nobody out there. There's no pope who picks the Republican nominee. It's a process, and it's the Republican primary voters, state by state. I'm already seeing people, even Christian leaders, sort of weep and wail and rend their garments at the thought of Trump in 2024, to which I want to say to them, you have no control over the outcome here, because it will be the Republican primary voters. And let me tell you right now, I believe that if Trump wants the nomination in 24, the nomination will be his in the same way that it was in 2016. And my point here is there's a large constituency in the United States of America that leftists and even conservative Christians at the more elite and institutional levels are just sort of failing to understand where these people are politically. So that'd be a point I'd make. Yeah,
no, I think that's a good point. And yeah, my views and how they changed over the course of his administration and all that, could be for another conversation. Sure. But I definitely agree with you. I think that nearly all of our institutions, whether they be secular or Christian, are really, really misunderstanding the hardcore Trump base, but even the base that kind of grew outside the hardcore, which were more of like late to buy on.
Sure.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. But yeah, so less than a year since Afghanistan. Now here we are. Russia has invaded Ukraine. There's a lot going on out there. I mean, has it even been a week yet since they invaded?
It's just been about a week today.
Yeah. It's been about a week today. It feels like it's been 2 months. There's already been a lot of media attention to it, debates on Twitter and elsewhere. Can you help us understand some of the context that led to this, previous to even just a week ago, or even just a month ago? Because about a month ago, we started to see Putin making some moves that seemed more aggressive before he actually invaded or started shelling any bases or cities. What was some of the context that led to this situation?
Sure. I'll try to keep it sort of brief and top line, but historically, one of the most important pieces of context is NATO Expansion, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a treaty that was formed immediately after World War II with the United States, Great Britain, and a variety of other countries. And that expanded. It's a security cooperation. It's an international treaty. It's a commitment to help defend each other's borders and preserve, coming out of World War II, what people hope to be a new world order of liberal democracy and peace. And NATO, served as a bulwark against the USSR, the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union fell, there were conversations between then Premier Gorbachev and NATO in the United States that when Germany reunited and joined NATO, that would be the end of NATO expansion. Like, you have to understand that Russia views the West as sort of an existential threat and great power competition. And we have similarly viewed them that way, certainly during the Cold War and the fight against communism. But with the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, the realignment that we've been living in and under for the last 30 years, NATO expansion has continued to provoke Russia. I'm just giving a fact. I'm not saying whether it should or shouldn't provoke Russia. But if you want to try to understand it, think about it from this perspective. How would the United States feel if one of our if China formed a deal with Mexico and put a bunch of troops and heavy weaponry on our southern border? We wouldn't like that. We would view that as a threat.
Yeah.
So continue NATO expansion all the way up to the border of Russia with Estonia, Latvia, etc., has frustrated them. Now, my take on Putin, this is just my take, people will disagree with it. I don't view Putin as somebody who's trying to reconstruct the Soviet Union. I view Putin in a more sort of historical Russia imperialist czar type character. He doesn't want to make Ukraine a sort of a subservient state. He wants to reincorporate it into historic Russia. He thinks it belongs to them. So NATO expansion has aggravated Russia. And many people have argued that the best thing that we could have done for Ukraine was to help make them a neutral state that is neither aggravating Russia nor fully committed to the West. And I would argue it's a good thing Ukraine is not in NATO right now, because then we would be committed to defending them from a full military perspective. So that you've got NATO expansion, and then you have historic tensions between sections of Ukraine that are heavily populated by Russian people. So whether that's Crimea in the south or the Donbass region, that's more on the northeastern corner, there's been fighting, there's been pro-Russian separatist movements. That's true. Russia, Putin has totally lied about, neo-Nazis and all this stuff, but there are pro-Russian separatist movements that Putin has played and taken to his advantage. So that's certainly played into the context. And then I would have to say, historic weakness from the West. And I think, as you mentioned, the way that there have been a variety of foreign policy disasters under this administration. And if we think back to what potentially attracted Trump to a large swath of the American people, was that he appeared strong. This is classic sort of Reagan-esque peace through strength, and coupled with a clear moral superiority. I think one of the ways we won the battle of the Soviet Union was we presented a better moral alternative of a way to live, and we projected peace through strength. I'm not convinced either one of those are happening under the Biden administration.
Yeah. So I want to go into more of that context in a little bit, particularly around like the NATO issue and so on. But recently at CPAC, Trump said Putin invaded or started war under Bush. He started war under Obama. Mm-hmm. He didn't do anything while I was there, and now he started war again. Seemingly implying by that he had done something special or different that either kept Putin appeased, happy through good diplomacy, or afraid to overstep his boundaries. Is he making? Would you back up his implication there? Was there something different and more effective in the Trump administration foreign policy that would have prevented something like this from happening now, or was it just? Did it really not have as much to do with Trump and more Putin seeing right now to be more, better opportunity?
Yeah. Well, from the outset, let me say that's sort of like shaking a crystal, magic ball, right? I can't give you a definitive answer one way or another. So this is speculation. As there's a preacher in and around the DC area, Lon Solomon at McLean Bible Church, way back in the day. He's gone. Well, not way back in the day. He's not there anymore. But he had these little clips on the radio where he said he would talk about the gospel or the Bible or Jesus, and then he finished saying, "Not a sermon, just a thought." But this is not a sermon, it's just a thought on this. But 2 points are really important on this: energy and power. Under the Trump administration, we were I would say ruthlessly committed to American energy independence, and we achieved that. We were moving forward with the Keystone XL pipeline. We became a net exporter of liquefied natural gas. Energy prices were down. We helped achieve a historic peace deal in the Middle East, and we were threatening sanctions on, this is very important, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that Russia, which is a gas pipeline that Russia has running through a northern route through the Baltic Sea down into Germany. And I have to say, in terms of context, look, nobody made Putin roll tanks into Ukraine. Nobody made him start launching fire, on Kherson and Kiev, nothing like that. But Germany plays a big part in this. Germany, in entertaining the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which were it to become fully operational, which it isn't yet, but at this point, Putin, I think, believed that it would be, they have a southern pipeline that goes to Ukraine that they can completely shut off. So during the Trump administration, we projected power, we pursued energy independence, we pressured Germany to do the right thing in regards to Nord Stream 2. And I believe that we were led by and large by serious individuals in our national security apparatus, with some potentially notable exceptions. So what that has to do with Trump vis-a-vis Putin, I'm not in Putin's psyche, I can't say. Yeah. I will say that we have, I would argue, thoroughly hamstrung ourselves as an American people and even as Christians in order to think clearly about this with 4 years of the nonsense of the Russian collusion narrative. When in fact, I'm not trying to be overtly political, but these are facts that it's the Clintons and it's the Bidens who have been involved in corruption in Ukraine historically. And so I think that all that to say is when Biden came into office, he relaxed certain policies and pursued a 1-2 punch of canceling Keystone XL pipeline and stopping the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, projecting historic weakness. I think helps Putin feel like, well, now's the time I can roll. What are they going to do?
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't want to fall into the logical fallacy of, after, therefore, because of.
Sure, exactly. This is, like I said, speculation.
Yeah. Yeah. But it does seem it is really hard to not look at the sequence of events, the changes in foreign policy. Like you pointed out, too, that's something that I hadn't considered until a bit later, the energy issues and how those affected this. It's really hard to not see all that and consider that has to have something to do with it. All these things had to have something to do with Putin's calculations.
Sure.
They seem to make a lot more sense than some of the other theories. One of the other theories that I wanted to bring up and get your thoughts on was going back to NATO. Mm-hmm. One of the main talking points that I've heard from people, and particularly the past week has been really disorienting for me, as I've been arguing with a lot of people who I normally am like on the same side with, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But instead of me finding myself like really, I'm like, well, we're not on the same side of this issue, even though we usually are on other issues. When it comes to this,
welcome to every day of my life on just about every issue.
And so, arguing with people who are taking, and I'd say maybe the poster child for this position would be like Tucker Carlson right now, and all of his responses. He's like, we need to stop provoking Putin, and we need to stop poking at him, and we need to stop. We're really the ones in the wrong. The West is the ones in the wrong because we were expanding NATO and we wouldn't commit to not allowing Ukraine into NATO. And so that's why he's doing this. I started hearing people on Twitter argue the same point. And I tried to push back and say, is the NATO issue something really that would really an issue that would justify him launching an invasion into Ukraine? And once he took that step, shouldn't we just say, okay, he's in the wrong now, full stop, regardless of the NATO issue going into it? On top of that, it just does.
Is that a question for me? Is that what you're saying? You think?
Well, I'm saying I don't agree with this position. This theory that says that that our meddling with NATO and Ukraine is the reason that Putin invaded, because I don't think it makes sense. Number one, because if he's so concerned about NATO being on his borders, why would he move his borders closer to NATO by absorbing Ukraine, which would then literally put his eastern border right up against NATO countries, right? Right now, Ukraine is a buffer. Also, it seems as though invading the nation that's in question would really undercut your argument for why they don't need to be a part of NATO. And then the third thing that I think this theory doesn't make sense is that as a defense of Russia in a way is that these debates then still don't seem enough of a provocation to justify a full-scale violent invasion. Mm-hmm. So that's my issue with this theory that I've been seeing really floated around a lot in right-wing Twitter and media lately. What do you think in terms of the NATO theory for why Putin has been taking these steps? Do you think that it really satisfies?
Well, at the outset, you asked me about context, right? So I set forth the idea of NATO expansion as a key piece of the context of the overall issue, right? So I think that it's undeniably part of the context.
And I agree with that. I agree with the context part. Yeah.
So also, this is really important, right? I was a history major. History is complicated. History complex. History is moving. As you're living in history, it's unfolding live. We should eschew monocausal explanations, right? So push back on the single, neat, tidy explanation. So am I going to say that a history of NATO expansion is the only reason why Putin rolled tanks into Ukraine? No, but I am going to say that you cannot ignore that context, and that if you don't deal with it honestly, I think you will be finding yourself lacking in an overall understanding of what's happening right now. And there have been very serious foreign policy thinkers, through the last decade who have warned of this, from Henry Kissinger to Meir Shemeyer, and George Kennan, back in 1998, he warned that NATO expansion was a tragic mistake and that would ultimately provoke a bad reaction from Russia. And there have been other scholars who have warned that as we lead Ukraine down the path of potential NATO treaty ascension, that we're just leading them down the path to get wrecked. And then who's going to be there to take care of them when they get wrecked? Nobody. It's hard to argue that's not what's happening right now. Now, look, are we going to arm them? Yes. Germany is sending them munitions. We're sending them, shoulder launching missile platforms to fight back, anti-tank artillery, etc. But we're not going to commit troops on the ground. In many ways, the Ukrainian people are on their own in combination with whatever weapons that we supply to them. So again, I don't think you can't count that out. And then what does Putin think about it in terms of Ukraine vis-a-vis NATO? Putin 100%, if he has to choose between Ukraine being a part of NATO and Ukraine being a part of Russia, he's going to choose it being a part of Russia, even if that means, on the further western border, Romania, Hungary, etc. It does border NATO countries, because for him to succeed in what I think is his objective of regime change, in terms of getting in a president who is entirely pro-Putin, or just reincorporating it into Russia, I think that for him is a big enough victory that it ends the NATO conversation. It's over that.
Yeah. Okay, I agree with that, and that makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people are also concerned about media manipulation, and they're concerned about propaganda. And there's surely a lot of propaganda coming out right now from both sides. There's a lot of Russian propaganda out there, and there's plenty of propaganda on the Ukrainian side too. There's already been a lot of stories just in the first week that have been debunked, turned out to not be true, or even if they're not, just outright falsehoods, kind of manipulating images and storylines and so on. So how do we discern our response to this Russia-Ukraine war when our corporate media has proven themselves to be quite unreliable?
That's a fantastic question. And I think, quite frankly, Christian interaction with media reporting is one of the most crucial and underdeveloped areas of life, of daily discipleship that we need to grow in. I have worked over the last decade to try to not get swept up in what I call the narrative. I use that phrase a lot. I use the narrative a lot because the truth is that there is a narrative that's being spun. I was down at CPAC with the work that I do with the Freedom Center out of Liberty University, and I watched on TV as CNN, and I'm not picking on CNN on this because every other major news network does too, reported the Snake Island event, where they said, pound sand, Russian warship. And then they said all 13 soldiers died. They're all still alive. That was, and they didn't, it's interesting. You'll notice sometimes these major news networks, they'll report things and they'll say, we were unable to verify this with independent sources, our own sources. Sometimes they'll just report things that potentially fit the narrative more conveniently without that disclaimer. And I never heard that disclaimer on that event. And so it became, now we've rolled it back, but who knows what else we've bought. The Ghost of Kiev, I believe, has been disproven entirely. So Christians need to be very careful, I would say, in this situation, to not get caught up in the media narrative that's coming from CNN, MSNBC, mainstream sources, nor necessarily buying into a more monocausal explanation from like a Tucker Carlson, which, I'm not nearly as down on Tucker Carlson as a lot of people are. I think he raises a lot of good questions, and he is one who is willing often to counter the narrative, but of course he has his own perspectives as well. So all that to say, I would urge caution. And one thing in our social media age, I think Christians and just Americans, people haven't wrestled with, is that you can't know everything that you think you can know because of access to the news that you have. You can watch news for 10 hours straight. I saw David Axelrod. He's a former advisor, senior advisor, political advisor to President Obama. He had a tweet saying that he didn't feel like he could turn the TV off and go to bed because he didn't want to miss out on anything. And so even if you turn the TV off, you can open your phone and start scrolling through a news feed on Twitter or anything else. So it gives us this idea that we can have a far more comprehensive understanding of the situation than we really can, particularly during the fog of war. There's going to be a ton of misreporting on casualties. There's going to be a ton of misreporting on what's happening on the ground. Factual items such as the Ukrainian government arming citizens with AR-15s will be reported a certain way, and then there will be no follow-up on potential other issues with that, which, as I've dug into this, it seems like there's quite a bit of concern in Kiev currently of armed criminals who are, engaging in gang fights with each other, because Russia is still fairly far from Kiev. So in the capital city right now, there's not heavy Russian on Ukraine fighting in any way, shape, or form. And yet all the civilians have been given AR-15s, including the gangs and the criminals. And so if you get some in-person reporting on the ground there, you'll hear that crime is spiking, and there's been some ill effects of actions taken by the Zelensky administration. So all that to say, I plead and I urge caution, and to understand that things are not as simple. It's not as simple as Zelensky, awesome, Putin, awful. In broad strokes, sure, but there's a lot more going on.
Yeah. I like the way you put that. I think that we do need to think a lot more carefully with more complexity and more nuance to the whole situation. The problem that I see is a lot of people who are who have become really reactionary because they're so disillusioned by all of the media manipulation and lies we've seen over the past couple of years through COVID, different other racial events, rioting, and so on. They've just been lied to over and over and over and over again. And so they become almost reactionary to the point to where if they say X, then I'm going to respond Y.
Sure. And
so they've almost responded so much to the point of like, well, if you say Zelensky good, I'm going to say Zelensky bad. Have you seen that as well? Do you think that's like kind of the opposite ditch that we need to be sure we don't fall into?
Yeah, sure, no doubt. Well, actually, no, not at all. What are you talking about? I completely disagree. No, I'm kidding. No,
it's okay. You got freedom to disagree on this show.
No,
so
I was doing the thing, but
yeah.
Look, I mean, it's hard. I will say with a grain of salt, half joking with a grain of salt, that if the mainstream media says something, you're probably better off believing the opposite. I will say that generally, and I mean that primarily to try to spur people on to critical thinking and independent research as much as you can. And that goes both ways. So the problem, Aaron, is that, I'll go back to the narrative. The narrative is that Zelensky is this once in a generation hero of the moment, portraying this inestimable courage as he bravely leads the Ukrainian people against invading Russian forces. And evangelical leaders are just, quite frankly, I would say, gushing over him in unbecoming manners. So if I want to stop and think about who Zelensky really is and what he's doing and how I should think about him, that's not me being reactionary. Though I will say that if all I see are sort of like puff pieces on the courage of Zelensky, that is going to make me wonder, well, what more should I know about? And
Mm-hmm.
interestingly, Zelensky, first of all, keep in mind the guy is an actor, and if you think that he is not bringing all of his acting capabilities to bear on this situation, I think we would be naive.
Yeah.
Second is that Zelensky has a historic support for all sorts of things that Christians would find objectionable, which I find to be a very important piece in this, because I do not deny that he is showing courage. He's staying with his people, when the vast majority of other political leaders in a situation like this would have fled the country and yielded it to the invading power. Zelensky is 100% putting his life on the line, as best as I can tell, to stay and to stand with his people. So he's rising to the moment. He's displaying courage, and yet he's pretty morally objectionable character, which is just fascinating to me to see how certain evangelical leaders can do the calculation, or maybe they don't even know, to heap praise on him now, but they found no way to do such a calculation for Donald Trump. So I think
or John MacArthur.
Or John MacArthur, or
Yeah.
John MacArthur's, I think, a man of upstanding moral character, but yeah.
Well, I mean, his courage, whenever he stood up,
yeah,
to the Los Angeles city government.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's what they're responding to. They're responding to, even if it is a kind of whitewashed picture, they're responding to a picture of courage.
Sure.
And especially manly courage, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
people are also like really impressed with Zelensky's display of masculinity through this, which once again, like, okay, maybe some of it's acting, but some of it's admirable too, because he's staying in Kyiv. But yeah, none of that masculine courage was admired in MacArthur.
Yeah, that's right. So don't be reactionary for the sake of being reactionary. I would say that. That's not a Christian virtue. Don't call conspiracy everything that these people call conspiracy. Christians of all people should be truth seekers, because we serve a God of truth, and the classic worldview, all truth is God's truth. And so I think also Christians should display a measured thoughtfulness of how we engage in things without being swept up in every passing wind of public opinion. I think that's a distinctly Christian virtue that, unfortunately, I think has not been on display much in our leadership in the evangelical world over the last 5-6 years. Too often pastors sound like they're just baptizing CNN talking points, painting them with some thin veneer of Christianese, and then serving them up to their people on a Sunday morning. And that's not helpful or thoughtful. Yeah,
I agree with all that. The one, if I can still just give a little bit of pushback, the one thing that the one thing that I just maybe want to, like, just, maybe it's not even pushback as much as it is a question. In the heat of the battle that Ukraine's in right now, and going beyond all the media manipulation and propaganda, there's a lot of people really suffering.
Absolutely.
There's already been a lot of violence. Zelensky, whether we think he's an actor or whether we think he's a messiah, he's in serious danger, and he's staying there. So in spite of all the media propaganda and all that, there's a lot of real suffering and a lot of stakes on the line right now. And so how helpful is it right now to be arguing, debating, and making these issues of discernment with media manipulation our primary talking points right now, versus making our primary talking points how should the West respond in helping Ukraine and denouncing Putin's actions? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
My question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and so far in this conversation, we focused on historical context, political and causes of the issue at hand. If you want to ask me, what should Christians be doing right now?
And that's what I'm wanting to get towards. So that's what I'm making my way towards.
Right. Yeah. So, look, I think that, I think now is both a time for discernment and for prayer, for lamenting and for being thoughtful. Absolutely, Christians should lament the loss of life. There's a real loss of life. The current reports are that there have been 1 million Ukrainians who are fleeing for refuge. Ukrainians, they don't want to stay and fight this fight. Essentially the Ukrainian government is conscripting men 18 to 60 to stay and fight. And quite frankly, I don't think a lot of those guys want to stay and fight. So it's true suffering. War is hell. It's one of the greatest manifestations of the sinfulness of man on clear display in the world. So I think we do need a posture of concern, of prayer, of lament for the loss of life. And it's totally fine to not want to engage in conversations about propagandas, media narratives. If I were to say something, I'd say that it'd be easier for your average Christian to avoid those conversations if our leaders were more thoughtful, and if the individuals who we look to sort of filter and mitigate these issues for us weren't swept up in the narrative so often themselves, so that when you're just a pew sitting Baptist and you're trying to figure this out, and you turn to somebody who sounds, who's a Christian public figure, but they sound just like the mainstream media, and that sort of raises a little bit of cognitive dissonance for you, well, then that distracts you from doing things like just, how can I pray for Ukraine? How can I think about that? So I would,
that's a great point.
I would encourage our leaders and our pastors to be different. Look, I listened to the briefing this morning by Dr. Moeller, and I thought he did a great job raising some wonderful points. I mean, he honed in on how this is a great moment for evangelism. He said that in the face of real evil and suffering like a war, the postmodern illusion of competing truth claims just shatters. So if you're talking to a non-Christian neighbor or friend or coworker who's lamenting what's happening in Ukraine, this is possibly an opportunity for you to share the gospel with them as they are being forced to deal with the fact that there's true good, there's true evil. And if there is, who decides that? The judge of the universe. Who is that? God, who is his son, Jesus Christ. And we all have that same evil within our heart. So I really appreciate Dr. Muller's point on this as an opportunity for evangelism. I'd like to see more of that.
Yeah, that's good. I'm going to link that episode to the show notes for this. So if there's anybody listening who wants to go listen to Al Mohler's briefing episode from today, this is March 3rd that we're recording. You can find that in the show notes. What kind of responses should we be seeing, expecting, or demanding from our civic leaders? So we covered Christian response, prayer, discernment, evangelism. What about from our governmental leaders? There's should we expecting them to intervene militarily, escalate, de-escalate? How do you think that they should respond?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think that we should. I do not think that we should commit troops on the ground. I don't think we should get embroiled in another war on the European continent. Not with a nuclear power, not with Russia. I think we should be seeking de-escalation as much as we can while holding Russia, Putin, and the oligarchs in Russia accountable. So some of the things we've done so far are fine, in as much as they'll have any effect. Sanctions, seizing assets, sort of seeking to isolate and impose economic costs on the leadership in Russia. But we have to bear in mind that we'll certainly have costs on the Russian people as well. So I think that we should certainly sanction Russia. Sanctions sometimes take a while to kick in. I know this very well from working at the State Department. So sanctions often sound like you've done something when you haven't really done anything yet. You see yachts getting seized around the world, et cetera. I mean, those might have some influence. I do think that NATO, European NATO countries, Germany, et cetera, should arm and equip Ukrainian military and fighters to be able to resist this real invasion. Russia is seeking to conquer Ukraine, and we should not want to see that happen. And so whether the U.S. has committed millions, hundreds of millions more in security assistance to Ukraine, I think that's fine. That's a good thing. So we should supply the Ukrainians as they fight for the country. We should really encourage the European countries to get up. One of the key policy priorities of the Trump administration was to get Germany and the other NATO countries to spend the 2% of gross domestic product that they were supposed to be spending on defense, and they weren't doing it. And finally, Germany has announced that they're going to do it. Well, we've been asking them to do it for 4 years because we realized that they've been coasting on American largesse from a military and security standpoint, and we were concerned something like this would happen. So we should continue that, seriously pushing them to do that. But I think that we also need to look at ourselves. That'd be the last point. We should look at what we need to do for our own economy, our own policies. We should restart the Keystone Pipeline. We should make it clear in no uncertain terms to Germany that they absolutely cannot allow the completion and the functioning of Nord Stream 2. If that whole thing is a sunken cost for whichever German company is working it, I can't remember the name. It's Gazprom on the Russian side, I believe. That's fine. That pipeline should never come online. But I think that we should project strength, but we should not commit our own troops to this fight.
Yeah, I agree as well. I know we're getting close to the end of our time here, so one last question to help our audience make sense of all this. I think, and just something I realized once again, looking at current media coverage, we hear a lot about sanctions, but I'm not sure if a lot of people actually know what that means. What does it mean that the U.S. or other countries are sanctioning Russia? So in just plain terms, can you help us to understand what sanctions are and why they're a good deterrent or de-escalation measure?
Yeah, well, I mean, in general, sanctions are, they're inhibiting, they're usually targeted towards certain companies, towards the governmental entities of Russia to prevent them from being able to engage in global commerce, to sell, to buy, to cut them off from the economy. Essentially, a sanction is meant to stop you from engaging in global commerce. So, we have had new sanctions that target Russia's defense sector, which I'm sure that, they threaten, heavy fines and penalties for any U.S. company. That's really all we can control. U.S. companies who are doing business with Russia. So sanctions are one big stop doing business with this sector, with this government, with these individuals. They're not allowed to have access to, certain economic opportunities, et cetera. So sanctions hit economically. They don't hit from a military perspective. So, yeah, so they're trying to essentially, our Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs, he had a recent quote. I'll just read it for you. He says, my view is that it's going to be very hard for anyone to buy major weapon systems from Moscow in the coming months and years. I mean, so this is an issue, right? Turkey, who is a NATO ally, has been purchasing Russian military equipment, and that's a huge issue. And we really dragged our feet on sanctioning Turkey on some of those dealings. For example, don't buy. We will actually hopefully punish you now if you're buying Russian military systems while they're invading Ukraine. It's stuff like that.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. I think that really helps to clear up. I like to clarify terms that are being thrown around a lot that people usually don't stop to define. So I think that's helpful for people who, once again, don't have extensive background in government, or it's been a long time since they took civics. Yeah. Well, William, we're wrapping up, getting close to the end of our time. Do you want to tell our audience how they can get in touch with you, follow your work, and learn more about what you're doing?
Sure. Well, Aaron, thanks so much for having me on. I think this is a great service that you're seeking to do for the listeners, the subscribers of the Filter podcast. And these are really important issues. It sounds like you've thought through them well, so I commend you for that. This has been a really interesting and enlightening conversation. You can follow me on Twitter at William_E_Wolfe. I just joined about 5 months ago after I used Twitter primarily as a news source for many, many years. And I find it to be a pretty useful news source, quite frankly. But I went ahead and decided to join the fray for good or for ill. So you can find me on Twitter. I write for the Freedom Center, the Standing for Freedom Center out of Liberty University. And I'm also currently partnering with American Reformer, which is a new American Protestant publication that seeks to equip Christians to live faithfully in our increasingly hostile and confusing times, covering issues that maybe aren't going to be covered by sort of your mainstream evangelical publications, and also often covering issues that will be covered, but from potentially different angles. than you would get. So tonight I'll be hosting a Twitter Space conversation with Dr. Scott Yaner on Christians and contraceptives. So we publish articles and then we bring our authors on to talk about them. So you can follow American Reformer at AM Reformer on Twitter. So those are the three main ways. I'm always happy to try to help folks think through the tricky intersections of faith and politics, particularly after having spent 10 years with my feet on the ground in Washington, D.C., seeing how these things work up close and personal. Like you said, there's a lot of confusion, and I'd like to try to bring some light to that confusion.
Yeah. Well, I think you definitely brought us some clarity today. All that stuff you mentioned for our listeners will be linked in the show notes. So if you're interested in following William on Twitter or looking into any of the organizations, publications that he's working with, all that will be in the show notes. So make sure you click the link in the description below, and I'll have that right there handy for you. William, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Like I said before, I think you brought a lot of clarity. I enjoyed the conversation. I think our listeners are going to be helped by it and enjoy it as well. So thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And I'll just close with this. We should certainly pray for peace in Ukraine. We know that the Lord directs the heart of the kings like water in his hands, and that if it's in God's will, this conflict could cease today. And we should be praying for that, for peace and protection, and for his will to be done on earth as it is.
Amen.
All right, thanks, Aaron.
Thanks for listening. I hope this episode provided you with biblical clarity to live with confidence in our confusing world. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me, you can go to my website, aaronchamp.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter so that you can be updated anytime I share new content. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Aaron M. Champ. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Until then, hold fast to the aim.